Hi, how are you?
Fine. Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Well, listen, we've already introduced you. You are speaking us from Nairobi, I take it.
I am.
Excellent. Well, why don't you kick it off, and then we'll take some questions, please.
In just 2 days, we will mark 8 months since war erupted across Sudan. That's 8 months of horror, violence, displacement, and immeasurable suffering that the Sudanese people have had to endure in what has become one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. The suffering is unimaginable, what we're seeing on the ground. Yet the crisis has not been getting the international focus and attention that is warranted, as the conflict continues to upend millions of lives and worsen what was already an incredibly dire situation. Today, as WFP, we are warning of a looming hunger catastrophe by next year's lean season if we're unable to expand access and regularly deliver food assistance to people trapped in conflict hotspots such as Khartoum, the Darfur region in the west, and the south central Kordofan region. I was speaking to one of my colleagues yesterday whose family cannot escape the capital in Khartoum, unable to get past checkpoints to flee the violence. Amid ongoing airstrikes and shellings, they're risking their lives to go outside to purchase basic goods. Even now, they're struggling to put food on their plates. Yet when the lean season hits in May and food becomes less available, they may be out of options unless WFP can get through and regularly deliver assistance. The hunger crisis is deepening at an alarming rate, as a new integrated phase classification food security analysis has determined. Now, as many of you may be aware, the IPC is a widely internationally recognized 5-phase scale that provides common standards for classifying the severity of food insecurity. So this new analysis shows the highest level of hunger ever recorded during the harvest season, which is ongoing right now. And it's typically a period where more food is available. And if there's not a significant increase in food assistance by the time the lean season arrives in May, conflict hotspots could see the emergence of catastrophic hunger, or level 5 out of 5, the highest level on the integrated phase classification scale. Nearly 18 million people across Sudan are facing acute hunger right now. This is equivalent to the entire population of the Netherlands, and more than double the number at the same time a year ago. This figure is also higher than the initial projection of 15 million, which was made in the previous assessment in August, which demonstrates just how rapidly the food security situation is worsening. Close to 5 million people are in emergency levels of food insecurity, which is 4 out of 5 on that scale. And of those 5 million people, 3/4 of them are cornered in areas where humanitarian access has been intermittent and in some areas nearly impossible due to ongoing fighting. Since the start of the conflict, WFP has provided life-saving assistance to over 5 million people, preventing an even worse deterioration of food security, especially in eastern and northern Sudan. But this is only barely scratching the surface compared to the immense needs of what we are seeing on ground. My colleagues in Jazeera State, where many people from Khartoum fled to, say they see crowds of people lining up, but there is not enough assistance on hand to support everyone. Only those in the highest levels of hunger are able to receive support, meaning that others could also slip into deeper levels of hunger come May when that lean season hits. Regular and safe humanitarian access to civilians in areas worst hit by violence has quite frankly been inadequate. WFP has been able to take advantage of momentary lulls in fighting to reach families in Greater Khartoum with food assistance, but we've only managed to reach the capital one time in the last 3 months. And only 1 in 5 people who WFP has identified as most urgently in need of food assistance in the Khartoum area has received food aid since the conflict started. Now, we've also managed to open up a humanitarian corridor from Chad to Darfur, where regular convoys of food assistance have traveled across the border since August, providing over 500,000 people with food assistance. So far, we've been able to provide food assistance in West and Central Darfur states. However, in other parts of the Darfur region, like South Darfur, some people have not received any assistance since June, despite WFP's repeated attempts to obtain safe access. The picture I'm painting here today is extremely dire. And as WFP, we are so alarmed of what will happen next to the millions of people who are looking to us and other aid organizations in their greatest hour of need. That is why WFP, alongside the entire humanitarian community, is urgently calling on all parties to the conflict for a humanitarian pause, especially in the conflict hotspots that have been the hardest to reach, and unfettered access to avert a hunger catastrophe in the upcoming lean season. Lives are depending on it. I'm available for any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Leni. We'll start with Edie Leder, Associated Press.
Thank you very much on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association for doing this briefing. As Steph said, Edie Leder from the Associated Press. WFP is one of the few organizations that actually still trying to operate in Darfur, where there have been reports of mass killings on the scale of what happened in the early 1990s and the possibility of another genocide. You called the situation horrible and impossible to reach people there. What are your staff saying on the ground about the situation in terms of the fighting?
Go ahead, Leni.
So our staff on the ground are obviously extremely concerned. We've had staff going from Chad into Janina, into West Darfur, to do assessment missions and to carry out these distributions in areas where we have been able to negotiate access. And they're coming back reporting of ghost towns where just massive destruction of homes. And most of the people, many of the people in Janina, West Darfur, have fled across the border and Chad. So then on the Chad border, you have people living in unimaginable conditions, under tents, barely having any basic goods. And so this is the reports that we're receiving on ground. And as I mentioned, some of our colleagues still have their families trapped in Khartoum, and they're literally living day by day, fear of airstrikes, shellings. Even today, we received reports of intensified fighting in Khartoum. And these are people that are literally trapped because they try to get out and there are checkpoints and they risk their lives just to go outside. And these are the reports that we're hearing from our colleagues on ground. And also, in addition to that, I was just recently in Port Sudan. And you can't imagine how much that city has changed in just under a year. It is completely overcrowded, and the prices of everything have gone up exponentially, in some cases up by 7-fold. The currency is devaluating at an extremely quick rate, potentially up to 300% inflation rate by the end of the year. And people are really struggling to get by and also starting to revert to very negative coping mechanisms, including increased criminality. And that now specifically is in Port Sudan, where the situation in the east is still relatively safe and secure. So I hope that paints a more clear picture for you of what's happening on the ground in Sudan. And thank you very much for your question.
Thank you. Anade?
Thank you so much, Anada Al Jazeera English. You mentioned that your colleagues in Khartoum haven't been able to leave Khartoum because they can't get past the checkpoints to flee the violence. And you also talked about the fact that WFP has only been able to get into Khartoum once in the past 3 months, I think. Can you explain the nature of these checkpoints and the exact obstacles to getting in and out of Khartoum?
Sure, thank you so much. So first of all, these are not our colleagues specifically. These are family members of our colleagues who are still trapped. And I can't specifically say which checkpoints, but they're in different. So Khartoum is a very complex conflict zone at the moment because you have different parties to the conflict that are in control of different areas. So you have different checkpoints set up along different routes. So you can imagine basically almost every, let's say, intersection or several intersections, there are armed groups. And the reports that I'm hearing is just that Khartoum is full of these different armed groups. And so what makes it challenging for WFP to try to get in there is that the majority of our food assistance and the commodities and the stocks and the trucks that we have are in Port Sudan and are coming in through the Red Sea state, through the Red Sea. And moving those convoys into Khartoum, where you're crossing various different lines of control by the different armed groups, RSF or SAF, these negotiations are extremely sensitive, extremely nuanced. The communication channels are difficult, and also the conflict still is ongoing. So, for example, we reached Khartoum once in the last 3 months, just at the end of November. So from the 20th of November to the 6th of December, we had food distributions going on in an area of Khartoum called Karari, where we reached around 100,000 people. However, at that same time, we were hoping to provide more assistance to people in another part of Khartoum called Jebel Aulia, but the fighting was just far too intense to safely transport goods over to that different area. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Maggie, then Ibtisam.
Hi, Leni. It's Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. Thanks so much for taking the time to brief us. Could you talk a bit about your funding needs? I didn't hear a number yet. And is the WFP assistance that you're doing primarily cash vouchers or actual food baskets? You did mention commodities stuck in Port Sudan, so just wondering. And are you able to reach the people who've fled to Chad okay? Are you at least able to help them?
So thanks so much for your question. We are actually indeed also facing a funding shortfall of over 250 million US dollars for the next 6 months in order to try to scale up to at least reach the people that are in the highest levels of hunger, which is between 6 and 7 million people, what we're planning for next year. And so funding is also a very big issue. As I mentioned before, my colleagues in Jazeera were on the phone with me today telling me they can't help everybody who's lining up and who technically are acutely food insecure in this level IPC3 out of the 5. Because of this funding gap, we are forced to prioritize only those in the higher levels of hunger. So funding, in addition to the access, is most certainly one of our main concerns. And so we are asking the international community and donors to step up on that.
Thank you. Ibtisam?
And then on the is it vouchers or food assistance?
Yeah. So this is all food assistance at the moment. So we're providing monthly emergency rations containing cereals, which is either sorghum, wheat flour, oil, salt, and then some kind of pulses, in some cases split peas, in some cases lentils. So that is on the food assistance side, but we are also providing nutrition assistance. So in the form of peanut packets, which help to prevent malnutrition, and different types of nutritional supplements that come in the form of powders. So that's what we're able to provide at the moment, but we are exploring different modalities or different pathways where we can provide assistance, for example, through cash or vouchers. But cash is actually a really difficult thing in Sudan right now because of the liquidity crisis and because of the banking system is in a state of collapse. So that has been extremely challenging for us to navigate through over the last 8 months since the conflict started.
So you said prices are high, but are there actually food items available plentifully enough in the markets? Like, is there adequate food in the markets?
I think you would have to look at very specific cases because the situation is different in different parts. I mean, Sudan is a huge country. So if we're talking about Port Sudan, yes, there is food available and it's getting extremely expensive. In Khartoum, from what I hear, there is still some food available. But as I mentioned, the price is getting higher and higher and higher. Right now is the time when there are the most crops available because it's the harvest season. So there is that availability. However, we expect these stocks in the markets to be depleted by May, which is typically the lean season. And that's what we're extremely concerned about.
And then, sorry, the other question I had on Chad, you didn't answer. Just, are you able to reach the refugees
The
who fled
question
to
on
Chad?
So actually, exactly. So our operations in Chad are also facing extreme funding shortfalls. I would have to get you the exact number of that funding shortfall. I believe it's around over 150 million. And we may have to cut rations for refugees in Chad. Of now, I think it's around 500,000 people, Sudanese refugees in Chad. I would get back to you on the very specific numbers, but this is also an extremely huge concern for us.
Thank you. Ibtisam, and then we'll close off. And then I have a statement I was just given on Sudan, which I'll read out.
Hi, Ibtisam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have just a quick follow-up on funding. First, you talked about 200 million. Is it until the end of the year? And it's only in Sudan? Like, it has not include your operation for Sudanese refugees in other countries. Is that correct?
Exactly. So to be very precise, it's exactly 252 million US dollars for Sudan alone, for our operation in Sudan alone, from now until May. So for the next 6 months.
Okay. And also, you talked about the different challenges you are facing, the war and the funding. Is there other issues, whether environment, climate change, other challenges, like major challenges that also affecting your operation, or these are mainly the two things that you would say influence your work? Thank you.
So definitely climate shocks have impacted Sudan quite a lot, and it's actually been one of the main drivers of food insecurity. In some seasons, we see too much rainfall, in some seasons, not enough. So in some cases, we're seeing droughts, and then in some cases, we're seeing overflooding, like what happened in Khartoum in 2020. So this is one of the major drivers of food insecurity, had previously been, and the conflict is exacerbating that. There's a large water scarcity in the Darfur region, which again also fuels food insecurity, as farmers don't have enough water available to properly irrigate their crops. So this is one of the big issues. Also, the other big issue is how the conflict is impacting the agricultural production, because the price of fertilizers and fuel and seeds have gone up, at least doubled since the conflict started. And so farmers are struggled when it was the planting season a couple months ago, struggled to actually sow their seeds, which is why we're also at the current moment seeing a below average harvest compared to the last 5 years, which again is only going to fuel that food insecurity and the rising levels of hunger.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leni. I'm just going to read out a statement I was just given on Sudan, which could be of interest to you. The Secretary General welcomes the encouraging developments in the context of the Extraordinary Assembly of the Heads of States of the International Intergovernmental Authority on Development, otherwise known as IGAD, that was held in Djibouti on December 9th, which discussed the situation in Sudan. He reiterates the United Nations' commitment to support the mediation efforts of its African partners and to work with all other relevant stakeholders to help end the war and restore peace in Sudan. The Secretary General is gravely concerned by the unwillingness of the parties so far to cease hostilities, which has caused untold sufferings for civilians across Sudan. The Secretary General's personal envoy for Sudan, Ramat Lamamra, stands ready to engage with all parties and partners to advance the cause of peace in Sudan. And that's been shared with you. Leni, I want to thank you for what I think is your first noon briefing appearance, the first of many, we hope. But thank you very much, and please pass on our thanks to all your colleagues in Sudan who are doing amazing work in difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you for having
Bye.
me.